The first and sense message of the sermon is that God is continually at work in the lives of His people, even when there is no visible evidence that anything is changing. The title, God is Fighting Your Battle, even if you cannot see it, encourages believers to trust that God's activity is not limited to what human eyes can observe. During seasons of hardship, unanswered prayers, or uncertainty, it is easy to conclude that God is distant or inactive. However, the sermon challenges this assumption by reminding listeners that God's work often takes place behind the scenes, beyond human understanding. The sermon begins by acknowledging that everyone faces battles in life. These battles may involve financial difficulties, health problems, family conflicts, emotional struggles, career setbacks, or spiritual challenges. In such moments, people naturally desire immediate answers and visible solutions. When these do not come quickly, discouragement and doubt can begin to grow. Há diversidade de dons. The sermon encourages believers not to interpret silence or delay as evidence that God has abandoned them. Instead, they are invited to trust that God continues to work according to His wisdom and perfect timing. A key lesson is that God's perspective is different from the human perspective. People can only see the present moment, while God sees the entire course of history and every detail of a person's life. Because of this complete knowledge, God may be accomplishing purposes that are not immediately visible. What appears to be a delay may actually be a period of preparation, protection, or spiritual growth. The sermon teaches that believers do not need to understand every detail of God's plan in order to trust His character. The message also emphasizes that faith involves believing before seeing results. Faith is not based solely on visible evidence, but on confidence in God's promises and His faithful nature. Throughout the Bible, many individuals experienced long periods of waiting before witnessing God's intervention. These examples remind believers that God's apparent silence does not mean inactivity. Instead, He may be arranging circumstances, shaping character, or preparing the right moment for His purposes to unfold. Another important aspect of this keynote is the encouragement to resist discouragement. Difficult circumstances often tempt people to lose hope or question whether their prayers matter. The sermons teaches that these moments are opportunities to deepen trust in God rather than abandon faith. Instead of focusing only on present problems, believers are encouraged to remember God's past faithfulness and to believe that He remains in control even when situations appear impossible. Prayer is presented as an essential response during seasons of waiting. Rather than giving up, believers are encouraged to continue praying honestly and consistently. Prayer strengthens their relationship with God, brings peace to troubled hearts, and reminds them that they are not facing life's battles alone. Although prayer may not always produce immediate changes in circumstances, it often transforms the person who is praying by increasing patience, hope, and spiritual maturity. The sermon also teaches that God's unseen work should inspire patience rather than passivity. Trusting God does not mean doing nothing. Believers are encouraged to continue fulfilling their responsibilities, making wise decisions, helping others, and living faithfully while waiting for God's guidance. Faith combines confident trust with responsible action, recognizing that God often works through ordinary daily obedience. It is important to understand the sermon's message with balance. The statement that God is fighting your battle expresses a biblical theme of God's care and support for His people, but it should not be interpreted as a guarantee that every difficulty will end quickly or exactly as a person desires. God's answers may come in different ways, including providing strength to endure challenges, wisdom to make decisions, opportunities for growth, or changes in circumstances according to His will. Christians may still experience suffering, but they are encouraged to believe that God remains present and active throughout every season. In conclusion, the first keynote teaches that God's work is often invisible before it becomes visible. Believers are encouraged to trust His wisdom, even when they cannot understand what He is doing, by remaining faithful in prayer, resisting discouragement, and continuing to live according to God's guidance. They can face uncertainty with hope and confidence. The message reminds listeners that although they may not always see God's hand at work, they can trust His character, knowing that He is present, faithful, and continually working for His purposes in their lives. The second keynote of the sermon emphasizes the importance of remaining steadfast in faith during life's most difficult seasons. The speaker explains that every believer will experience challenges, disappointments, and moments of uncertainty. These trials may include financial struggles, illness, family conflicts, emotional pain, career setbacks, or spiritual battles. While such experiences are often painful, the sermon teaches that they should not be viewed as evidence that God has abandoned His people. Instead, difficult times can become opportunities to develop stronger faith, greater perseverance, and a deeper relationship with God. The sermon begins by acknowledging that hardship is a normal part of life. Many people mistakenly believe that faith in God guarantees a life free from problems. However, the Bible shows that faithful individuals often faced significant trials. These experiences were not signs of God's absence, but occasions through which He strengthened their character and demonstrated His faithfulness. The sermon encourages listeners to remember that temporary difficulties do not cancel God's promises or His love for His people. A central theme of this keynote is perseverance. Standing firm in faith means continuing to trust God even when circumstances do not improve immediately. It means refusing to let fear, disappointment, or discouragement determine one's decisions. Instead of giving up, believers are encouraged to remain faithful in prayer, worship, and obedience. Perseverance is not passive endurance, but an active commitment to continue following God despite uncertainty. Through perseverance, faith becomes stronger because it is tested and refined over time. Another important lesson is that faith is based on God's character rather than on changing circumstances. Human situations can change rapidly, and emotions often rise and fall depending on success or failure. Há diversidade de dons. The sermon teaches that believers should anchor their confidence in God's unchanging nature rather than in temporary conditions, because God is faithful, loving, and wise. Believers can trust Him even when they do not understand why certain difficulties continue. This perspective allows them to experience peace without requiring immediate answers. The sermon also highlights the importance of resisting fear. Fear is described as one of the greatest obstacles to spiritual confidence because it shifts attention away from God's promises and toward life's problems. Fear can cause people to doubt, make impulsive decisions, or lose hope. The speaker encourages believers to replace fear with prayer and trust. By bringing their concerns honestly before God, they receive strength to face challenges with courage rather than despair. Prayer plays a central role in remaining firm during difficult times. The sermon explains that prayer is not simply asking God to remove problems. It is also a way of maintaining close fellowship with Him. Through prayer, believers receive comfort, wisdom, and renewed perspective, even when circumstances remain unchanged. Prayer transforms the heart by increasing patience, strengthening hope, and reminding believers that God is always present. The message further emphasizes the value of obedience during hardship. It is often tempting to abandon spiritual disciplines or compromise personal values when life becomes difficult. However, the sermon encourages believers to continue living according to God's principles. Acts of kindness, forgiveness, honesty, generosity, and faithful service demonstrate genuine trust in God. These choices may seem small, but they reflect confidence that God remains at work even during seasons of waiting. An important point of balance is that standing in faith does not mean pretending that pain does not exist or refusing to seek practical help when needed. Believers are free to express grief, ask difficult questions, seek wise counsel, and pursue appropriate solutions while continuing to trust God. Faith is compatible with honest emotions and responsible action. Remaining steadfast means refusing to allow hardship to destroy hope or separate one's heart from God. In conclusion, para se dava keynote. The second keynote teaches that difficult times are opportunities to strengthen faith rather than reasons to abandon it. By remaining faithful in prayer, resisting fear, obeying God's guidance, and trusting His unchanging character, believers develop spiritual maturity and resilience. Although challenges may continue for a time, they can face each day with confidence, knowing that God remains present, faithful, and able to accomplish His purposes